great. So as we know, China's special economic zones and industrial parks produced very remarkable impacts for China's structural transformation and also urbanization. And the aim of this panel then is to understand to what extent is China's experience of that being reproduced or translated elsewhere in the world? And what are the roles of Chinese and host states and firms and other local or transnational actors in this form of policy mobility? And then extending from that, we also want to think a little bit about the implications for urban development in those countries. And I think in this panel, we've got case studies from Ethiopia, Nigeria, briefly a couple of other African countries, as well as in Asia, Indonesia, Malaysia, and India, all of which, as far as I can see it, have engaged somewhat differently with China's model, if such a model exists. So this should be very interesting to compare. I hope everyone's had a chance to look at the presentations materials in advance via the conference website. Obviously, we're not going to have presentations now. We will just have very brief 2-minute pitches from each of the panelists on the key contribution of their paper, as well as perhaps addressing this question of to what extent is China's experience being reproduced or translated elsewhere, followed by questions. So if ever anybody has a question to raise during the pitches, you can use the chat function, the Zoom chat. Please type your question in the chat box, or if that's not possible, you can use the hand raise function, which is under reactions at the bottom right of the screen, I think it is. And then we will have a more general discussion and some questions from the panelists as well. All right, Tom, are you here? I think I can see your name.
I'm here. Can you not see me?
I can't see you, no.
Well, my camera's on. I can see myself. If that's, you can hear me, that's the important thing.
I can certainly hear you, yes. I can see you. I can see you now. Good. So over to you, Tom. Please, could you summarize the contribution of your paper here and what you think about this question of to what extent China's experience is being translated into host countries?
Okay, so here we go with this new quickfire format. First of all, apologies we didn't record a presentation in advance, and that is because we realized we'd actually presented this paper last year on a different panel, the same paper. But when Charlotte got in touch with me, obviously the relevance of our paper to this panel is very close. And I hastily said, of course we'll be on the panel. Anyway, so here we are again, but we thought we would just put up the slides from last year rather than doing it again. And I hope that if people have had a chance to look, they will see that we do engage very strongly with these themes in the paper around policy mobility, around Chinese economic zones, specifically in an urban context and in connection to questions of urbanization and the kind of relationship between urbanization and industrialization, particularly industrial parks. So there's been a lot of interest, especially in Ethiopia, on Chinese involvement in industrialization and in industrial parks, but there had been less on the Chinese industrial parks and how they sit with experiences of urban development, urban planning, urban change. So that's what we're looking at. We were also looking at it in Uganda in a very different context. And what we really find in a way is the key finding is that the ways in which the Chinese experience is brought into these parks are very kind of haphazard and kind of improvisational as investors from China who've often been involved in completely different sectors, who've never worked or in an industrial park or developed one in China, are the kinds of people who've been developing them in the African countries we looked at. So it was only really over time when they faced certain hurdles and barriers, particularly around land and subdivision and so on, that they would then go back and start to draw on those Chinese experiences over time, and often in ways that were very stoppy and starty and only unfolded over many years. So yeah, it was really those actors, those Chinese actors who were doing the policy mobilizing and not in the kind of usual ways that you might expect. So I'll leave it there and I look forward to hearing the rest of the presentations.
Thank you, that's great. Yeah, we don't mind that you've given the presentation before. As you say, it's a very close fit for our interests here, so we look forward to the discussion. Okay, next, Hongjiang, I think, is going to speak. Yeah, over to you.
Yes, so thank you. And exactly like what Tom was saying, we're looking at many of these zones in Africa and elsewhere are developed by Chinese companies that actually don't have any experience developing zones in China. So the question we are trying to ask in our paper really is what roles have these companies play in the diffusion or mobility of industrial park strategies in Africa, and specifically in countries like Ethiopia that adopted such strategies relatively late. And we hope to, of course, go beyond the traditional state-to-state perspective and explore the dynamics at the micro level, and specifically the role of companies as transnational actors. And we believe that this is a common theme in our panel, because I think all our papers in this panel have discussed how Chinese companies as the developers of industrial parks respond and adapt to local conditions in shaping the industrial park practices. And what we hope to go a step further is by highlighting the nature of these companies as transnational actors with established presence across different African countries, and the intention of further expansion, and therefore to update our understanding about their role in the diffusion of policy ideas. And so policy diffusion mediated by these companies might have less to do with the policy practices in their home country in China than with their interest to secure their foothold in Africa. And as we demonstrate in the role of China Civil Engineering Construction Corporation, or CCECC, in Ethiopia's industrial park development, it shared its experience in its development of the Lekki free trade zone in Nigeria to the Ethiopian policymakers, not because the Lekki zone was a good example reflecting the Chinese success story, but to demonstrate CCEC's credential as an important market player and facilitator of government initiatives in another major African country, with the purpose of securing its market position in Ethiopia. And nevertheless, policy lessons were learned in this process between Ethiopian and Nigerian policymakers. And our argument, therefore, is that Chinese companies' facilitation of industrial park experience sharing in Africa is driven by their profit-seeking and market-seeking nature, and that, combined with local priority and political contingencies, explain the mutation of policy practices in the process of diffusion or mobility. And theoretically, we advocate that the international policy diffusion literature needs to take the role of transnational companies seriously, and especially in the diffusion of economic or industrial policies. So I also stop here and looking forward to your comments and feedback.
Thank you very much. That's fascinating. We'll go over now to Dingfei for the next presentation, 2-minute pitch.
Yes, thanks for having us in the panel. I believe we have a great lineup of papers. Our argument aligns with the previous discussions of Tom and Hong on the heterogeneity and fluidity of the so-called Chinese as-is model. And the specific contribution we hope to make in this exploratory paper is to unpack the subnational varieties of state-business relations and urban-industrial nexus to kind of engender diverse translocal flows of resources, experiences, and expertise. These subnational actors come with different economic capabilities, government relations, and business networks, and so will engender diverse and complex interactions with local institutions and agents in the host African country. That means instead of a universal model, there's likely to be what Zhang Jun called patterned heterogeneity of economic zones, which will cast varying impacts on the existing rural and urban dynamics in the zone area. But we are still in the process of developing our argument and pulling together information for the case study zones. So we appreciate any suggestions of resources or literature, and welcome any collaboration on this topic. Thank you. I look forward to hearing our feedback.
Thank you very much, and I hope there will be lots of collaboration on this topic. That's something I'm very interested in putting together. So yes, more discussion on that, I hope. Great, thank you. Let's go over to Angela next to talk about her work.
Okay, sorry, I prepared some slides, but it's still yeah, it's still 2 minutes, don't worry.
Okay. Very quickly.
All right, so hi everyone, and to sum up the main points of our paper that I co-wrote with my good friend and colleague Albin Kamba from Denver New, we addressed 2 main questions. The first one, is there a model of Chinese development when it comes to industrial parks? And the second one, is this model so-called exported through China's Belt and Road Initiative? And to answer them, we examine 2 case studies in Malaysia and in Indonesia. And we argue 3 main things. First, that China's model starts from its own domestic experiences, but then departs from them and adapts to different contexts through a process of directed improvisation, to borrow Yuan Ang's concept, if anyone is familiar with it. So in industrial parks built under China's Belt and Road Initiative, we see a strong input by the government in the initial phase, but then starts this flexible adaptation process whereby host country actors from government agencies, civil society, and elites shape the outcome through negotiations first and then contestations. And then these interactions, these negotiations and contestations result in feedback loops that change eventually host country governance and also Chinese corporate governance. So basically in this slide, I show the process with the empirical data, and our contribution is to frame this process of localization that starts from these G2G talks and then leaves room for all of these interactions in host countries, negotiations, contestations, and feedback from a number of different actors, even factory workers. And this ultimately explains why there is so much variation among different parks in different countries. And I stop here to leave enough time for discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was indeed within 2 minutes, despite the slides. So thank you for that. Yeah, Jan, over to you just to say a few words about our own e-paper.
Thank you, Charlotte, and great to meet you all. Yes, so we are not a formal paper on this panel, but we also had a paper, and I thought we should briefly introduce it. So I'll try to stick to 2 minutes as well. So we examined, Charlotte and I, we examined an industrial city in India, which was modeled on a Chinese counterpart. And we did fieldwork there in 2018, keeping the name anonymous. Our findings show that aspects of the Chinese model, if you want to call it that, are reproduced. And we say both intentionally and unintentionally, though. And that these are reproduced by different actors with different outcomes. So we focus on 3 lines of comparison between China and India, representing different mechanisms of policy mobility. So one is planning the layout of the zone and its spatial configuration. And we found differences in speed of expansion. So China fast, India slow. We looked at recruitment firms, hiring practices within the zone. And we found similar practices in China as in China, in India, but differences in the autonomy of migrant women, which was much higher in China than in India. And thirdly, in terms of urban integration and incorporation of villages, we found similarities in that sort of kind of urban villages are being created in the Indian zone that you can see in some Chinese zones. So we just say, we don't use a word like, for example, Angela did, like directed improvisation, but we just say that models cannot be straightforwardly replicated, and more attention needs to be paid to outcomes of attempted replication and their urban development implications. So that's from us.
Thank you, Jan. Okay, so just perhaps if I just sort of recap what I take from this, and then we'll throw it open to questions, including I have some questions to put forward, and I'm sure you do as well. But several key lessons that come to me from reading and engaging with these presentations and hearing the pitches now. One is that there is clearly no kind of straightforward policy transfer, as we might have expected. You know, the local context in the host countries, the economic and political and societal, geographical, cultural, and all kinds of contexts are extremely important in the translation of these zones into the host countries. Perhaps a bit less expected from my point of view was that the role of the Chinese central state seems to be much less important than we might have thought, and that Chinese subnational states, firms, and especially private actors, sometimes individual actors, are taking a dominant role in whatever kind of policy mobility is occurring, if we even want to call it that. And that the role of host country actors too, including governments and non-governmental actors, and even, as Angela just said, you know, factory workers, for example, is actually extremely important in shaping the outcomes of these economic zones. what we perhaps haven't touched on so much, and I'd really like to come to this in the questions, is the implications for urban development. So in many ways, the linkages between these industrial parks or economic zones and the local villages, towns, or cities seems to have been something of an afterthought when the zones were established, and dependent on very specific patterns of engagement between the Chinese and various different kinds of local actors. So I hope we could touch on that as well and think a little bit about that. All right, open to questions. Please do post any questions you would like to ask in the chat, or you could use the hand raise function, which is under the reactions.
Can I just quickly say, because in the 2-minute format, I forgot, but you're probably aware also that Zheng Li Huang is the co-author on our paper, yes, and yes. She's here, and you know, we'll have a lot to contribute to this discussion, having done most of the research with the Chinese firms. But she presented on another panel. That's the reason I was doing this solo. Okay,
yeah. I think most of these papers are co-authored, and we have quite a lot of co-authors here too. So that's great. Yeah, please, everybody, do chip in. Angela, I see you have a question in the chat. To me, it seems that many of the papers tackle with the initial phase of industrial parks, but are there any cases of contestations in the parks in Africa or even in India? Do you want to say a little bit about that, Angela, from your perspective of your case studies first, perhaps?
Yeah, I mean, I really enjoyed reading all of the materials online. I thought that there were a lot of you know, overlaps and a lot of points that were made are interconnected. So I think ultimately, like, that made me think a lot about how to shape, like, if there is a model, like what are the key characteristics? Is that the role of the, you know, a state that initially is there but then dissolves? But some papers also looked into private parks, so that I would say is a completely different process, right? Like, that is not part of the Belt and Road Initiative, or were they then probably enlisted in this you know, official list recognized by MOFCOM? That is a question that I had also for that paper. But then when it comes to a lot of these, I think in your paper, Charlotte, and with Jan, you tackle a lot of this after phase, right? So what happens after? And you talk about, you know, gender issues and a lot of other, you know, urbanization issues. But are there any contestations, like in all of the you know, parks that we describe in this panel, or where the inquiry is more into this initial phase of brokering for the establishment of these parks? Thank you.
Thanks. Just briefly, for us, certainly there is contestation, but ours is very much not the Belt and Road. You know, India was not part of the Belt and Road, and our parks, our park that we looked at and further case studies that we're looking at tended to have been inspired by China or indirectly modeled on China rather than any direct Chinese state involvement. And so any kind of contestation that we saw or engaged with was very much about you know, land expropriation and dispossession rather than anything specifically targeted at China or a Chinese model. I don't know about the other case studies and would also be interested in hearing this. Tom and Zheng Li, do you want to say anything about this in your case study? Perhaps that would be interesting.
Yeah, maybe I can chip in here. Thank you. So I think there are a lot of contestation there. I think in almost all the cases, and I think our paper is slightly different from the rest of our panel in that we focus mainly on the private sector. And in our case studies in Ethiopia and Uganda, I think it's fair to say that it is these private investors that are driving the formation or the development of the nexus between, you know, industrial development and urban development, which is one of the important topics that we're discussing today. And this is important, as Holland has already highlighted, because in almost the literature in global China or China Africa, the literature is almost dominated by state-centric narratives. And also in the policy mobility. So one of the contributions in our paper is that we see policy itself not mobilizing themselves, but rather they filter through actions. So it's very important in your question about whether there is the policy mobility or who are the actors. I would like to say yes, there are definitely the policies is diffusing and they're mobilizing themselves there. But it's more important to look at the process of the policy mobility something that is implemented through this improvising activities. And in our case, it's the private sector actors that are pushing, constantly pushing the boundaries. And one of the features of the private sector in our case studies is that they were able to constantly reposition themselves in relation to the hosting government, which is something that distinguished them from the state actors. And this is how they can, constantly generate new content in the formation of the, industrial urbanization nexus in the host countries.
Great, thank you. Anybody else want to comment on that? Maybe any of the other case studies?
I actually have a follow-up question for Zheng Li. Kind of, you mentioned the position of developers and how they can position themselves neutrally among the different stakeholders. And I just wonder if you have any examples, because in Ethiopia, the federal and the local government, regional government, they have like this enduring tensions, and especially given the ethnic tensions going on like in the past years. I just wonder, do you observe any like particular strategies that the zone developers use to navigate these political dynamics?
Thank you very much. I think they don't find themselves in a mutual position with the government, but rather they were able to adapt themselves to new challenges. For example, not only the Eastern Industrial Zone, for example, including the other one in Uganda, they were used first as a pioneer for the government to experiment, different models of industrial development in the host country. Sometimes they experiment with different policies and they fail sometimes, and in some aspects they succeed. But once something rooted and becomes a sort of a model, they immediately become a competitor with the national actors in the host country. And this is definitely a challenge that might not be found so often in the state with the, in relation with the state actors. But nevertheless, they were able to readapt themselves to new situations. They when I interviewed some of the Chinese investors, they said, it's okay if we become a competitor, let's compete. I think that's attitude, and also this is I think in this case, in our case studies in those two landlocked countries, it's the Chinese entrepreneurship is definitely one of the most important element in forming or sort of transferring this policy or the model from China, but only using China as a reference, but not replicating what they think is successful there.
Thank you for that. Yeah, again, we come back to this idea of, translating a model through many layers and definitely no straightforward kind of replication through this variety of different actors, maybe with really different motives. I think it's a fascinating idea, and I hope we can come back to that. Florian, I see you have a hand raised. Would you like to unmute yourself and ask a question?
Thank you very much, Charlotte. Yeah, I'd like to, so first of all, thank you very much to all the presenters for the really fascinating work you've all put up. I'd like to follow up quickly on a few of the points made by Charlotte and Dingfei. So 2 points really. One is about the scalarity of these different engagements. We've heard now a few times about different layers of actors, from federal governments to local governments. And there's quite a lot of work in, for instance, global production networks, but also when looking at kind of, infrastructure projects, these kind of things, about how the different scales of engagement matter, and how it quite often also leads to kind of relationships that transverse different scales, where federal actors engage with local actors and these kind of things. And then, so I was wondering, is that an element in the different case studies that people have been studying? And if so, how can we sort of better understand and theorize those kind of relationships? And following directly on from that about the contestation is how can we make sure that we take sufficient account of kind of pre-existing local but also interscalar politics? So for instance, in the Ethiopian cases, as Dingfei has explained, there were sort of pre-existing tensions that had little or nothing to do with the emergence of industrial parks, that then led to industrial parks, both Chinese and non-Chinese, becoming flashpoints for existing political conflicts. And if we sort of ignore the fact that those political conflicts existed, then we attribute all of those conflicts falsely, to an extent, to the emergence of these parks. And then it's easy to say, look, the Chinese arrived, they imposed some model, conflict ensued, right? And whereas the reality is probably much more nuanced and complicated. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that very interesting question. Ding, do you want to try to address that? You particularly look at this sort of role of subnational governments, so perhaps this scalar question would be best suited for you to start with.
Yes, thank you so much for the great questions. And for me, scale is of course an important element to explore, like you call it policy mobility or policy diffusion of the sharing of the economic zone experience. And in this particular paper, we are trying to look at how the subnational conditions in their home provinces may contribute different dynamics and maybe capabilities of resources for these going global companies. But in particular, if we look at Jiangsu or Guangdong province, they are more economically developed regions in China, and they have strong manufacturing sector and dominated by private capital. And the companies have already integrated into the global production chains or production networks. So that may influence some of their strategies while investing or operating in Africa. And when we look at Hunan, for example, their operation or investment in the economic zone are more led by the local state capital. And so there are more presence of the local state involvement. But of course, they engage in different relationships, like build a sister city between Changsha and Adama in Ethiopia. So there are different mechanisms being mobilized or explored by the different subnational actors, and they engage in different scales of activities, both domestically and overseas. So that's kind of our starting point to look at this.
Great, thank you. And Hongjiang and Tom, you both have hands up. Do you want to weigh in on that particular question? Hongjiang, did you have something to say on that?
I forgot to unmute myself. Sorry. Yeah, so I think I want to maybe follow up on a few questions that were raised in previous discussions. I guess Angela mentioned MOFCOM's role in all these overseas zones because there's official list. And what I have found so far, because I just freshly come back from my field work in Nigeria, so Lekki zone, of course, was one of the first zones to be listed in the MOFCOM list. But my observation is that Lekki zone pretty much has been neglected by all sides, by both Chinese and Nigerian sides, by the governments. Of course, the zone is very, very big. It's like 3,000 hectares, but so far only perhaps 10% of it has been developed. But due to other reasons, because there's a very major oil refinery being opened up, and also there's deep sea port being built near that zone, the zone seems to be receiving some new interest from investors. What I heard is that despite the zone, only 10% of the zone has been developed, the land has all been sold out. So I think there's a lot of land politics come into the dynamics of the development of these zones, and not necessarily from an industrial development point of view. A MOFCOM, so I asked the zone manager about the role of MOFCOM. Did MOFCOM provide any support at all? And he struggled to find an answer for me, because I think MOFCOM might have helped when they go back to China and try to attract investment, when they do these road shows in Chinese provinces and cities. When they have this official designation as a MOFCOM zone, overseas zone, it's easier for them to brand themselves and market themselves that way. But otherwise, there's very little tangible support from MOFCOM. And also, like Zheng Li was saying, that these, in the case of the private developers in the Ethiopian Uganda zones, very interesting. The private companies are very agile. But in our case, we see that CCECC as a major state-owned company is perhaps less agile. I think from what I could tell, it seems their strategy really is just to be there, to take a presence. And that's why, you know, over the Leki zone has been developed for over 10 years and it's still loss making, but they're still willing to be there. They are quite patient. So the patient capital concept comes into this. And also in Ethiopia, CCEC is also developing its own, is also investing in a zone and in the industrial park in Dire Dawa. And that's kind of competing with the government developed zone also in that same city. So yes, there's going to be competition, and I think that's interesting to see like why these large, less agile state-owned companies are trying to do all these, and how do they compare with the private companies. So I think that would be also an interesting direction to go into.
Thank you. And yeah, Tom, over to you.
Okay, thank you. My comment was actually in response to Florian's second issue around the contestations and the pre-existing conflicts, which I think is really, really important. And it just reminded me that in Ethiopia, and obviously many people in this room know about these situations and the strikes that were going on in the Chinese parks. And when Wei Chen was doing her work in those parks, linked to much broader conflicts in Ethiopia. But what was also interesting from our conversations with some of the Chinese advisors, not necessarily park owners, people who like someone from CAD Fund who were doing the Chinese development work, they were starting to see the conflicts around parks and other infrastructure they were investing in as leading them to think about doing development differently, thinking more about investing in services, public services, infrastructure in ways that they might not have done, partly because those conflicts were impeding their ability to be productive. So I think also that question of how this all feeds back into the changing Chinese approaches is an important one.
Good, thank you. Yeah, and a question in the chat from Dingfei, a question for Hong. Do you see intra-company sharing? Oh, sorry.
Sorry, before that, Charlotte, can I
add
yes. a point just to answer Florian's question?
Please do, please do.
In terms of federal government and local government. So one of the major learnings from CCCC's experience in Nigeria to Ethiopia is that in Nigeria, the Leki industrial zone was in the reign of the local government, and that has caused a lot of issues when the legislation involved with like customs that is in the federal government's realm. So one thing that Arkabet, the economic advisor to the then Ethiopian Prime Minister, learned from this experience is to get hold of the industrial park development rights into the federal government's hands. And that's also why in Ethiopia, major industrial park development was in the hands of the, yeah, that's what happened.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. I can see that Hong Dan has answered the question in the chat about sharing, suggesting that sharing is not organized or institutionalized between the different companies investing there. And there's another question from Zhengli to Angela about your case studies. How does the investor's private ownership status or any support they get from the state affect their decision-making and their positioning with the host country? Angela, do you want to go ahead and tackle that one?
Actually, they are private investors, but they are considered national champions, and they are very much linked with the Chinese government. So they received a lot of funding through the Belt and Road Initiative, for instance, from the China ASEAN Fund, which is a quasi-sovereign wealth fund linked to the Belt and Road Initiative, also from China Exim Bank, and this triggered a lot of private sector financing also from HSBC. So actually there is you know, a strong state support in terms of financing and also brokering, I guess, like with a lot of questions that then arose to answer Florian's question, like this question of it's not really Chinese companies that trigger, but obviously these contestations happen because there are certain sensitivities in these countries, right? So if we look at Indonesia and Malaysia, in Malaysia the Chinese Malay are much more blended with the society. Instead, in Indonesia there are still a lot of you know, racial issues connected to Chineseness, and so these have triggered a lot of sensitivities in these parks related to illegal labor, a lot of fake news, and a lot of news that were targeting, Chinese as a race, right? So I feel that the concept of embeddedness that I saw in some articles that I read recently may also be interesting, right? To analyze like how these parks then fit into a lot of conditions in host countries. Yeah.
Thank you. And then the final question from the chat, from Yanwal about the learning of Chinese companies, I think is really interesting because several of us talk about this. How do you operationalize and measure this corporate learning? Does anybody want to try and tackle that one? I think this is a good question because we've all seemingly stressed the role of Chinese firms rather than Chinese central states, that the firms and the actors within those firms are doing quite a lot of the heavy lifting on policy mobility, if we want to think about it that way. So does anybody want to come in on how do we actually understand this, what these firms are doing in terms of corporate learning?
I can go.
Yes, please.
In my experience, something that is very common is communication. So there is a lot of steps that have been taken, and I conceptualize it in the feedback loop type of. So because this process is not just changing Chinese companies, but then Chinese companies in Indonesia especially were targeted by a lot of fake news, and so they had to step up their communication strategy. Also hired people that were intermediaries inside their companies, right? So maybe from Indonesia or also in Malaysia this has happened, so that they would be in charge of the communication. And then sometimes they were also responding. So for instance, the question of illegal labor, some labor where, some workers were found without permits because, in order to get a permit in Indonesia, they would have to wait for 6 months to 1 year. And so this also was a feedback for local governments to improve this process and to improve the business environment in general for companies hiring foreign workers. Yeah, so that's my take.
Thank you. Does anyone else want to comment on the firms? Then I guess perhaps, oh, sorry, yes, please.
I would just quickly say, I mean, you can probably see it by the actions as well. So just take areas from elsewhere in my research. When Chinese firms began to acquire foreign firms, they used to take them over 100%, try to manage them. Later on, they noticed there are difficulties doing that, so they changed what they're doing on the ground. Keeping local management more, things like that. So I think you can also see it in the actions they're doing on the ground, that they are learning.
Thank you. And then I just want to finish off then with this final question about the urban form, because we've kind of put this under the umbrella of thinking about urbanizing futures, but actually not that many of us have talked really about the implications for urbanization. So I'd just like to think very briefly about that, and to what extent the resulting urban forms that come from these special economic zones and industrial parks are Chinese. Is there anything distinctively Chinese about them? Are we seeing a new hybrid urban form? What is happening in terms of the urbanization that's coming out of these parks? Does anyone have any final thoughts?
Sorry, this is Zhenli. In one of our case studies, the Eastern Industrial Zone, an interesting activity that they did is that they brought some designing firm from China and showcased a huge vision of combining two towns in Ethiopia together into an industrial town. I won't say it's a successful planning, but anyway, they were trying to convey this idea of urban planning in a way that they, the private investors understood it, and also the way that they experienced how industrialization and urbanization went together in China. And they wanted to bring in that experience in Ethiopia. And that's, I think, a big take, and also a contribution to the knowledge production in this field in Ethiopia by itself. And I can see after they're trying to pitch the idea of the industrial town, there were a lot of discussions going on in Ethiopia, while in the other case of Hawassa, which is not so much Chinese case, the foreign investors in the case of Hawassa, and also the local government is also trying their own ways of how they can improve the situation, challenge posed by the industrial park in the city. So this is, I think, an interesting showcase of how the Chinese model, function in that sense.
Fascinating, and I would love to talk more about that at some point. I mean, this is something that we also see in our work in India, which is much less direct involvement of Chinese actors, and certainly no involvement from the Chinese state directly, but this emergence of urban villages, very much on a Chinese urbanization model, was something that we hadn't expected to see in the context of an Indian urban development. So yeah, these kind of traces of Chinese urban forms that you're talking about here, and we found in our own work, I think are extremely fascinating. We are out of time. I hope very much that we can continue these conversations offline or in another format, because lots of potential for collaborative work here, lots of fascinating findings. So thank you very much, everybody, for participating. And yeah, please do keep in touch. I would look forward to continuing to talk about these and see where we can take this further. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you, Charlotte.
And please note the upcoming plenary at 1 p.m. I've been asked to remind everyone to attend, and the link is in the chat. Thank you as well from me for the interesting discussion, and it has been great to meet you all.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Everyone.
you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.